Hello, class. How are you doing? I'm coming to you from my office today. There's the train in the background. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit or highlight for you a little bit about thematic movements in Persepolis. And as with any piece of literature, a graphic novel, a regular novel, poetry, a play, a film, anything that we're working on, there are larger thematic movements that usually that tie into or have to do with the thing that you're reading. So two things to remember about thematic movements on the whole. So two larger ideas. Thematic movements happen and they bring continuity to a piece. So when you're reading it, you can recognize when things are showing up over and over again. And while you're reading, it's a good idea to take note of something that you notice that is happening, a conversation that's happening. That's the second thing, and that takes us to the second part of it, and that is that the thematic movements are not just words or large ideas that are thrown out there that can relate to anything. They're very specific to the piece that's being written. And I like to think about them as being a conversation between the author and whoever is reading it, so the reader. And that conversation usually happens outside of the explicit words. So a larger piece is never going to say that its thematic movement or its theme, it's one of its major themes is martyrdom. But it is going to use context and use everything that continuity and the repetition of ideas and symbols as a way to express a conversation under the original meaning or level that you're reading at. So usually you read for context, plot, character, growth, those kinds of things. But underneath that is a current that's running throughout, and that is the theme or the thematic movement. There are usually more than one in a graphic novel or in a novel, a larger piece. And they are often associated with or connected to symbols that you're starting to look at. And this short list is not everything. So in this list, there, for example, isn't the discussion of Margie's complex relationship as a child with religion and God. But that is definitely a thematic movement that is showing up quite a bit. And it really makes kind of a splash in the very beginning of the book. And there's a really interesting moment where she's being held by her God. And I know a few of you commented on that in your discussions. And so this is definitely a thematic movement, and it works in the same way. Religion, repression, and modernity is connected to that idea. But it's a little bit more tied into the specifics, a specific context that Margie finds herself in more than one places in the long part of the novel. So religion, repression, and modernity is the first one. Then we have nationalism, heroism, and martyrdom, violence, forgiveness, and justice, children, war, and growing up, issue of the personal versus the political, and the large issue of gender and childhood and learning about gender in a culture, dealing with ideas of gender. So I'm going to go through each one of those and just talk to you a little bit about each one of them. The reason why I want to do that is because I don't want you to fall into the trap of using just one term or a phrase to explain a large complex idea like a thematic movement. There should always be an explanation or some kind of analysis that goes along with identifying thematic movements. And that's part of the analysis that you're working on for the graphic novel. So the first one is religion, repression, and modernity. I'll keep this one short. Persepolis obviously explores the intersection of religion and modernity, as well as the impact of religious repression and on the religious feeling and practices of those who must endure it. And there are many examples throughout the entire graphic novel that discuss this. But I think that's a pretty good wrap up of this larger thematic theme that's moving through the book. The next one is nationalism, heroism, and martyrdom. When the revolution comes, Margie, like her family, rejoices after decades under the despotic American-backed Shah. She and her family believe that this moment will ensure that the Iranian people will finally be free to decide for themselves who will lead their country and how. Put another way, Margie is an Iranian patriot and nationalist in the sense that she believes profoundly in the value and need for an independent Iran ruled by Iranians. Margie's love for her country and belief that it should be free is so great that she feels the urge to fight for it and glorifies those who do fight for it, particularly those who die in the name of the cause, martyrs. Margie, just a child at this time, thinks of heroism in romantic terms and sees martyrdom especially as extremely positive and desirable. And this is another thing that we're seeing as a thread being woven throughout the entire book. The next one is violence and forgiveness and justice. The historical body count by the end of Persepolis is enormous. From the start of the revolution to the end of the Iraq-Iran war, over 1 million people die. On the battlefield, in the streets, in prison cells, killed by the Shah and by the Islamic Republic that replaces the Shah. By the end of the book, Margie expresses her sorrow that we could have avoided it all, indicating a belief that much of the damage done to the Iranian people was a result of the Iranian regime's own actions. Its warmongering with Iraq, its radicalization of young soldiers, its religious fanaticism, its valorism of martyrdom. One of the things that Margie deals with is the idea or the concept of forgiveness, and she poses it using a number of different characters, one of those being her mother, and she's conflicted. She shows her mom's conflict. She's also conflicted. And she shows her mother's conflict by early on in the novel by discussing or showing that her mom feels that forgiveness is really essential and important. And Margie takes that on and takes it into herself as a lesson. And then very quickly after, due to circumstances with family, friends, and family, and the treatment of the family, Margie's mom obviously has a moment where she wants vengeance and violence and retribution, which, if you're looking at ideas of forgiveness and justice, for justice, revenge is a type of justice, but it's not always a type of justice that is critically helpful. And so Margie is strapped with this complicated issue of justice and forgiveness. And the novel does a really good job of showing that kind of feeling of contradiction, and at times feeling of like kind of hypocritical ideas that are floating around. So this is a really important and a really large theme that shows up a lot. The next one is children, war, and growing up. Obviously, for Margie, this is a graphic novel that explores the perspective of childhood during a time of extreme or of extremes, of extreme violence, with complex political issues and family that's all involved in the same thing. Persepolis shows children to be extremely malleable ideologically and behaviorally during war, precisely because children do not yet have the capacity to understand the complexity of the situations around them. And this shows up, it pops up or bubbles up in a number of different places in the graphic novel, and is an extremely important, if not fundamental, part of the novel. It's what makes this graphic novel, it's what places this graphic novel among other stories of childhood, but it also shows another perspective, and that is the Margie that is grown and understands later on and is depicting that personage of the theme. So this is a foundational one. This is really an important one, and it also connects with the reader in a very personal way. So you can definitely feel for and empathize for Margie and what her young self is going through, while still being confronted with all the conflicts that she's dealing with as a child. And it's very painful to see many times. And in the middle of the novel, she really starts to identify with negative ideas. I'm speaking specifically about the part where she's enacting modes of torture because she's obsessed with this idea, and she's working it through and learning about it by role-playing torture with her friends or with the kids around her. And this is a really interesting moment. If you were writing an analysis about it, this is a really interesting moment to kind of dig in and look at and talk about the reality and how well Satrapi or Margie depicts difficult moments growing up. And you couldn't have that in a well-written graphic novel or a novel period or anything, any piece of literature without that. And so that is why that is probably one of the most fundamental thematic movements that is happening in the book. The next one is the personal versus the political. The question then becomes one of degrees, right? If one cannot escape the political in one's life, how much should one participate in the political sphere? Does one actually have a choice in the matter? So the question here, there is no answer necessarily, not yet. Analysis will get to a deeper understanding and a possible multiple solutions or issues that help to answer that question. And this is another one, just like the one that I previously talked about, that is, I think, extremely easy for those of us that are reading it to identify, because our world right now is strapped with all sorts of political issues that we are forced to look at, and we try to look away from, but we must look at it, and we must make that decision about how political we are being. And I think that that is surrounding us right now. So it's a theme that is very identifiable, and we can relate to it, even if it's not the same theme. It's not directly dealing with war. Gender is the next thematic movement that's happening. There are all of these discussions surrounding gender and the veil at the beginning, but also the idea or the concept of veiling of gender and the difficulty that Margie has with learning difficult truths about the world that she's currently living in, and how she deals with it as a young woman and a little girl. Over the course of the graphic novel, Margie begins to understand that to be a woman in her new society is to be subjugated to a lesser role than the one she expected to have in her younger years. So this is not just a discussion of what it's like to be a young woman, though that is fundamental to the book. This is a conversation that happens around multiple ideas about gender, what men, what women are told is correct, what is hypocritical in that, what conflicts with that. Those are all kind of laced and interwoven into the story, and it comes up quite a bit. It's also a really important issue that I think we can kind of identify with as well, or not, maybe not identify with, but that we can relate to as well. The questions that we have right now about what is it to be a woman? What is it to be a man? What are the varying degrees? What is the gray area? How do I feel about it? Is it a political issue? How do I deal with it as a political issue in our culture right now? And I think that that's why thematically this is pretty important. There are others that other thematic movements that are happening throughout the novel, the graphic novel, but these are the ones that I think are more characteristically fundamental to the entire graphic novel, meaning they're moving throughout the entire novel. So it's easier to pick up on these. And these are definitely conversations that are happening within the novel, but with the reader as well. These are questions that are being posed consistently, constantly, as you read the novel. You can't move away or look away from it. Just like the violence that you see mixed or woven with the moments of childhood that Margie shows that she's laughing and enjoying life and excited about life, is commingling. And to better understand the novel is, or a way to better understand the novel is to break it down into those thematic moments so that you can look more closely and have a more in-depth discussion with yourself and with the novel and with the class about what's happening. And the best way to do that is to empathize with Margie and empathize with the child that is in this graphic novel, that is moving through and growing as a result of it, as well as relating to the idea that this is an adult writing in the perspective of a child with the knowledge and the understanding. Like the end of the novel that I said, Margie says this could have been prevented, and she's putting responsibility on the people of Iran, the government, everything. And she's asking that question as an adult. She's not asking it as a child. And so putting the pieces together, we can relate to that as well, thematically, because we all had a childhood that we look back on, and that we have this ability to kind of identify with certain things, work through certain issues, push away or not acknowledge certain issues. She's doing that in the novel. I think she does a really good job of that. Diving in with analysis and looking at those themes is what is important about going through this and reading it as a class. And even though you're doing most of this on your own and you're by yourself when you're reading it, it's important to recognize those things. I'd like you to start to think about those different thematic movements and start to choose ones that are really interesting to you. What are you interested in particularly? I don't want you to write an essay on all of these, but I would like you to pull out a few of these themes and start to look through the book and identify where they're showing up, so that we can have a larger conversation about it, and we can move to an assignment that asks that you dive a little deeper and really start to think about how this novel is affecting you, the reader, and what it might say about our culture right now, and what we can learn from it. And that's, I think, what's the most important thing here. So that's what I wanted to do today, was just go through some of these themes, and it's good to see you guys. I just also wanted to give a shout out to a few people for some really great work. You guys have been working through these literature circles really well, and the images from the illustrators have been excellent, and the connections that you guys are making, reading through those. If you're reading through them as well, there were definitely a few places that I was completely stunned and so excited that you were able to bring a completely different perspective, and make connections. So discussion director is really important as well, and you guys have been doing a really good job of that and answering those questions. Those are all also linked to these ideas that we're going to get to with the larger assignment for this essay, and for this book. So, all right, I hope you guys have a really good day, and I hope you enjoy your spring break because it's coming up. It's around the corner. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.